When Marcus Thompson pushed open the door to the executive break room on the 20th floor of Technova's glass tower in downtown San Francisco, his brain simply refused to process the scene unfolding 3 feet in front of him. Sarah Whitmore sat in the leather recliner positioned by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Bay Bridge, her charcoal Armani blazer draped over the armrest, the silk blouse beneath unbuttoned enough to reveal what Marcus's exhausted mind couldn't reconcile with any version of reality he understood. Little Jaden nestled against her chest, nursing with an intensity that sent ice through Marcus's veins, because this wasn't a bottle, wasn't the hypoallergenic formula he'd spent $200 on last week, wasn't anything remotely close to what should be happening between the CEO of a $3.2 billion company and an 8-month-old baby whose father stood frozen in the doorway like someone had just rewritten the laws of physics. Sarah's eyes lifted slowly, locking onto his without moving her head, without disturbing the baby whose small hands clutched at the fabric of her blouse with desperate familiarity. Tears streamed down her face in thick lines that carved through what remained of her makeup, mascara pooling at her jaw, and the expression she wore contained something Marcus had never seen in the 2 years he'd worked at Technova, never glimpsed even in passing when she walked through the engineering floor with that trademark Ice Queen efficiency that made junior developers literally step backward into cubicles. This was raw grief, exposed need, a vulnerability so absolute it felt obscene to witness. Her lips barely moved, the words emerging as broken whispers that Marcus almost didn't hear over the blood pounding in his ears. "Please close the door. Lock it. I forgot to lock it." Marcus's hand found the door handle through muscle memory alone, his conscious mind still 3 steps behind what his eyes were reporting. The lock clicked with a sound that seemed to echo through the silent room, and suddenly the world condensed to this impossible tableau, this CEO worth more than most small nations, cradling his son, while tears fell onto the baby's soft curls, while Jaden nursed with the kind of focused contentment Marcus hadn't witnessed in 8 months of watching his child reject every formula brand on the market. 20 minutes earlier, Marcus had been drowning in code at his desk on the 15th floor, 3 energy drinks deep into a debugging session that should have taken an hour but had stretched into its 4th because the legacy system integration kept throwing errors nobody could explain. The delivery deadline sat 5 hours away, immovable, because the sales team had promised the client a demo tomorrow morning, and failure wasn't an option when you worked at a company where missing deadlines got you added to the quarterly layoff spreadsheet. Jaden had been with Nicole from the UX team, probably chewing on one of those silicone teething toys while she sketched wireframes, and Marcus had allowed himself to sink into the zone where code became the only reality that mattered. Looking back now, he could identify the exact moment everything shifted, though he hadn't recognized it then. Tyler had wandered past his desk around 9:15, coffee mug in hand, mentioning something about Sarah taking Jaden to the 20th floor. The words had registered at surface level only, filed away as background information while Marcus wrestled with a particularly nasty database query. Sarah Whitmore taking his baby upstairs didn't trigger any alarms because Jaden had become the unofficial mascot of the entire engineering division, passed between developers like a good luck charm, showered with attention from people who spent most of their lives staring at screens, and welcomed the excuse to interact with something small and warm and human. But Sarah Whitmore was different. Sarah Whitmore was the woman who had built Technova from a seed-funded startup in a Palo Alto garage into a unicorn that dominated the enterprise software space, who had fired 300 people in a single day when the Series C funding fell through, who walked into board meetings and emerged with whatever she wanted through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. Sarah Whitmore didn't do small talk in elevators, didn't attend the monthly happy hours, didn't interact with individual contributors beyond the occasional all-hands meeting where she delivered quarterly results with the warmth of someone reading a phone book. Marcus had never spoken directly to her, not once in 24 months, because there were 8 layers of management between a senior engineer and the CEO, and those layers existed for reasons that seemed self-evident. The realization that something was profoundly wrong had arrived gradually, building through a series of small observations that accumulated into dread. 30 minutes passed, then 45, and when Marcus finally extracted himself from the code long enough to check on Jaden, Nicole said she'd handed the baby to Michelle 15 minutes ago. Michelle hadn't seen Jaden in the last 20 minutes, thought maybe Tyler had him. Tyler was in a meeting. The chain of casual custody that usually worked perfectly suddenly revealed its gaps, and Marcus felt his chest constrict as he moved through the floor, asking increasingly urgent questions that all led nowhere, until someone mentioned seeing Sarah head toward the executive elevator with Jaden sleeping against her shoulder. The executive elevator required a key card Marcus didn't have, but the stairwell worked fine, even if it meant climbing 5 flights with his heart rate spiking, not from exertion, but from the growing certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. The 20th floor was sacred territory, reserved for C-suite offices and the kind of conference rooms where acquisition deals got hammered out. And Marcus had never set foot there before today, had never needed to, because his world existed in the concrete realm of API endpoints and data structures, not strategic vision and shareholder value. The executive assistant stationed outside Sarah's office had been on the phone, barely glancing up as Marcus moved past, and he'd followed the sound of silence to the break room at the end of the hall, expecting to find Jaden asleep in a portable crib, or maybe crying while Sarah tried unsuccessfully to soothe him, not prepared for anything close to the reality that ambushed him when he opened that door. Now, standing with his back against the locked door while his son nursed from his CEO's breast, Marcus experienced a cognitive dissonance so profound it felt almost hallucinogenic. This couldn't be happening, because it violated every professional boundary, every social norm, every assumption about how the world operated. But Jaden's small body told a different story. The way he latched on to Sarah with the desperation of someone who'd been searching for exactly this for months, who'd been trying to tell Marcus something through 8 months of rejected formula and weight percentiles that dropped steadily toward the danger zone. Sarah kept her eyes locked on his, still crying silently, not trying to hide or justify or explain, just waiting while Jaden did what babies do when they finally find what their biology demands. The minutes stretched into something that felt like hours, time becoming elastic and strange in this room where normal rules clearly didn't apply. Marcus should have been angry, should have been horrified, should have been calculating how to report this to HR or whether California law made this kidnapping or assault or some category his mind couldn't name. Instead, he felt a collision of emotions so tangled he couldn't separate them into discrete threads, couldn't process anything beyond the simple observation that his son looked more content than Marcus had ever seen him, more satisfied, more fundamentally okay. The biological impossibility of what he was witnessing finally penetrated his shock enough to form words, though they emerged hoarse and uncertain. How is this even happening? Sarah took several deep breaths before responding, her voice raw in a way that suggested she'd been crying long before Marcus opened the door. Let him finish. Then I'll explain everything. I promise you'll understand. Or at least I hope you will. Because I know how this looks, and I know what you must be thinking. So Marcus waited, sinking slowly down the door until he sat on the polished hardwood floor that probably cost more per square foot than his monthly rent, watching the impossible scene continue while his mind spun through scenarios and explanations that all fell apart under the weight of reality. Sarah was his boss, technically several levels removed, but still in his chain of command. Sarah was 42 years old, according to her Wikipedia page, which he'd read when Technova's IPO made national news. Sarah was the Ice Queen of Silicon Valley, profiled in Forbes and Fast Company and Bloomberg, always photographed in severe black suits with her dark hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, never smiling, never revealing anything beyond calculated corporate messaging. This version of Sarah Whitmore existed in a completely different universe, vulnerable and broken, and doing something so intimate that Marcus felt like a voyeur just by being present. But Jaden was his son, and whatever was happening here demanded answers, even if those answers rewrote everything Marcus thought he understood about professional boundaries and human behavior. Jaden's nursing slowed after another 10 minutes, his small body gradually relaxing into the boneless satisfaction of a completely satiated infant. Sarah adjusted her hold carefully, supporting his head with practiced ease that suggested she'd done this before, and Marcus filed that observation away, along with all the other impossible data points accumulating in his shell-shocked brain. She kept one hand cupped behind Jaden's skull while she used the other to fix her blouse. Movements economical and unself-conscious, and Marcus found himself looking away, even though the moment for modesty had passed somewhere around the time he'd watched his son nurse from a woman who wasn't his mother. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice carried the careful control of someone trying to hold together something that wanted desperately to shatter. This was the most important thing that ever happened to me. What just occurred in this room. I need you to understand that before anything else. Before you call security or HR or whoever you're already planning to call. Marcus shifted against the door, his back aching from the awkward position, but he couldn't seem to move, couldn't break the strange gravity of this moment. I'm not calling anyone yet. I just need to understand what the hell is going on. Sarah looked down at Jaden sleeping in her arms, peaceful in a way Marcus recognized from the early days after Keisha died, when his mother had flown out from Baltimore and somehow gotten the baby to sleep for 4-hour stretches despite Marcus's complete inability to manage more than 20 minutes before Jaden woke screaming. Whatever had just happened had produced the kind of deep, satisfied sleep that only came when a baby's most fundamental needs had been met, and Marcus couldn't ignore that evidence even as every other part of his brain insisted this situation demanded immediate action. I lost my daughter last week, Sarah said, the words emerging flat and dead despite the tears that hadn't stopped falling. Her name was Emma. I made it to 18 weeks this time, before my body decided it couldn't support life. 4th time. 4 pregnancies, 4 losses, each one taking a little more of whatever hope I had left. The information landed like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything Marcus thought he knew about the woman holding his child. Sarah Whitmore had always seemed more like a force of nature than an actual human being, someone who existed on a different plane where normal concerns about relationships and family and biological imperatives didn't apply. The idea that she'd been carrying grief this massive while running a billion-dollar company, while firing people and closing deals and projecting absolute confidence in quarterly earnings calls seemed impossible until Marcus remembered his own journey through the last 8 months, how he'd coded through funerals and debugged through nightmares, and somehow kept showing up to work, even when getting out of bed felt like climbing Everest. I didn't know, Marcus said, inadequate words for an inadequate moment. Nobody knew. Nobody knows anything about me beyond what Forbes publishes. I've made sure of that. Kept every personal detail locked down, because showing weakness in this industry gets you destroyed, gets you replaced by the board with someone younger and hungrier and willing to work 100 hours a week without the distraction of wanting things that normal people want. Sarah shifted Jaden slightly, her movements gentle and practiced, and Marcus noticed for the first time how naturally she held him, how her body had adapted to accommodate his weight without conscious thought. The pregnancy hormones are still in my system. My body prepared for a baby that isn't coming, produced milk for a child I'll never feed. When I picked up Jaden this morning, when he started fussing in that specific way babies do when they're hungry, something happened that I didn't plan or anticipate. The oxytocin flooded my system so fast, I actually felt dizzy. And suddenly my breasts were letting down milk, and Jaden was rooting against my chest with this desperate urgency, and I acted on instinct instead of logic. Came up here, locked the door, and gave him what he was asking for. The clinical explanation somehow made the situation feel more surreal rather than less, like Sarah was describing someone else's actions, some other woman who had crossed every conceivable line between appropriate and catastrophic. Marcus tried to organize his thoughts into coherent responses, but everything kept fragmenting against the image of Jaden, nursing with that desperate intensity. Against the knowledge that his son had just received something Marcus had assumed was lost forever when Keisha died on that operating table, while doctors shouted codes and nurses ran for equipment that arrived seconds too late. How long were you planning to do this without telling me? The question emerged harsher than Marcus intended, sharp enough that Sarah flinched, but he couldn't quite regret the tone because anger was starting to break through the shock. Righteous fury at the violation, even if the outcome had clearly benefited Jaden in ways Marcus couldn't deny. I wasn't planning anything. This wasn't calculated or premeditated. I picked up your son because he was crying and everyone else was busy, and my body responded in a way I couldn't control. And suddenly we were here, and it was happening, and I couldn't make myself stop because it felt like the universe was giving me one moment, one single moment, to experience what I've been trying to achieve for 6 years through IVF and miscarriages and fertility specialists who keep finding new ways to tell me my body is broken. The rawness in Sarah's voice cut through Marcus's anger, exposing something underneath that looked a lot like his own grief, his own desperate scrambling to find meaning in loss that seemed senseless and cruel. Keisha had been 26 years old, healthy, excited about motherhood in that cautious way people have when they've watched friends struggle through complications and stillbirths. The pregnancy had been textbook perfect, every checkup confirming that mother and baby were thriving, right up until the moment Keisha's blood pressure spiked during labor, and the doctor started using words like eclampsia and cerebral hemorrhage and catastrophic. Marcus had held his son for the first time while his wife died 6 feet away, had felt Jaden's tiny fingers curl around his thumb while monitors flatlined, and a doctor he'd never met before delivered the information that would detonate his entire life. 8 months later, he was still figuring out how to exist in the aftermath, still learning to breathe through the moments when grief ambushed him in grocery store aisles or during code reviews, or at 3 a.m. when Jaden woke crying for a mother who would never come. The idea that Sarah Whitmore carried her own version of that devastation, had been functioning at the highest levels of corporate leadership while bleeding internally from losses nobody else could see, created an unexpected bridge between them that had nothing to do with org charts or pay grades. I need to take him to the pediatrician, Marcus said finally, the words emerging from some part of his brain still capable of practical thinking. We have an appointment at 2. The doctor's been worried about his weight, about the formula rejection. I don't know what to tell her about this. Sarah nodded slowly, carefully transferring Jaden to Marcus's arms without waking him, and the loss that crossed her face when the baby left her embrace was so profound Marcus had to look away. She stood with visible effort, reaching for her blazer, transforming back into the CEO with each breath, even though her eyes were still red and her mascara had created dark smears along her cheekbones. Tell her the truth. Tell her a woman who recently miscarried was holding your son and experienced spontaneous lactation due to hormone fluctuations. Tell her that your son nursed for approximately 35 minutes and fell into the deepest sleep you've seen in months. Tell her whatever medical facts are relevant to his care. Marcus rose as well, cradling Jaden against his chest while reaching for the door lock with his free hand. The baby's weight felt different somehow, more substantial, as if those 35 minutes had added density to his small frame. We're going to have to talk about this again, about all of this, because I still don't understand what just happened or what it means or what the hell I'm supposed to do with this information. Sarah met his eyes for a long moment, her expression settling back into the controlled mask Marcus recognized from company meetings, though something in her gaze remained raw and exposed. I know. And I'll answer whatever questions you have, explain anything you need explained. But right now, take care of your son. Make sure he's healthy. That's what matters. The drive to Dr. Morrison's office passed in the blur of San Francisco traffic and racing thoughts that refused to organize into coherent patterns. Marcus kept glancing at the rearview mirror, watching Jaden sleep in the car seat with that same profound contentment, occasionally checking to make sure this was real and not some stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many energy drinks and too little sleep. The appointment had been scheduled for weeks, another in the long series of increasingly worried visits where Dr. Morrison documented Jaden's failure to thrive, where percentile charts showed downward trajectories and the specter of hospitalization loomed closer with each weigh-in that came back below expectations. Dr. Morrison had delivered hundreds of babies during his 30 years at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, had seen every variation of feeding difficulty and failure to thrive, but his expression when Marcus explained what had happened suggested this particular scenario was new territory, even for someone with his experience. He listened without interrupting while Marcus laid out the facts in chronological order, starting with finding Jaden missing from the 15th floor and ending with Sarah's explanation about miscarriage and spontaneous lactation, trying to keep his voice clinical and detached, even though the story felt insane coming out of his own mouth. And you're certain it was actual breastfeeding, not bottle feeding with expressed milk or formula. Marcus shifted Jaden to his other shoulder, the baby still sleeping peacefully despite being in the examination room where he usually screamed through the entire appointment. I saw it with my own eyes. There was no bottle involved. It was direct nursing, and Jaden latched on like he'd been doing it his entire life instead of being exclusively formula-fed since birth. Dr. Morrison removed his wire-rimmed glasses, cleaning them with methodical precision that suggested he was buying time to formulate a response. His office had photographs on the walls showing him at various stages of his career, starting as a young resident in Atlanta and progressing through decades of practice that eventually brought him to California, to this pediatrics clinic where Marcus had been bringing Jaden since week 2 when the first formula experiments began failing. The medical facts are straightforward enough, Dr. Morrison said, replacing his glasses and pulling up Jaden's chart on the computer. Women who experience late-term pregnancy loss can indeed produce milk due to sustained hormone levels, particularly if they were in the second trimester or beyond. The letdown reflex can be triggered by proximity to an infant, especially one actively seeking to nurse. From a nutritional standpoint, breast milk is incomparably superior to any formula on the market, which is why the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends exclusive breastfeeding for at least 6 months whenever possible. Marcus heard the clinical information, processed it on an intellectual level, but his emotional response remained tangled and confused. "But this isn't my wife breastfeeding our son. This is my boss, someone I don't know beyond professional interactions, someone who just did something that feels like it should be illegal, or at minimum, completely inappropriate." Dr. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from clinical to something more personal, more grounded in the messy realities that medical textbooks didn't adequately address. Wet nursing has existed throughout human history, Marcus. It was standard practice for centuries, continues to be common in many cultures today. The taboo around it is relatively recent and largely cultural rather than medical. From where I sit, looking at Jaden's chart and the concerning trajectory we've been tracking for months, what happened today might have been the single most nutritious and beneficial experience of his entire life so far. The words landed with unexpected weight, reframing the situation in a way Marcus hadn't considered while standing in that 20th floor break room watching his CEO cry. He'd been thinking about boundaries and appropriateness and what HR would say, not about the simple biological fact that his son had just received exactly what his body had been desperately seeking for 8 months of frustrated formula rejection. "He's never nursed this well before," Marcus admitted, looking down at Jaden's peaceful face. "Keisha died before she could even try breastfeeding. We went straight to formula in the hospital, and it's been a nightmare ever since. 4 different brands, 3 different bottle types, consultations with lactation specialists who had no solutions because there was no breast milk to work with. Watching him refuse food over and over while his weight dropped has been killing me slowly. And today he nursed for half an hour like it was the most natural thing in the world." Dr. Morrison pulled up the growth charts, pointing to the curve that showed Jaden hovering just above the 5th percentile for weight, dangerously close to the threshold where hospitalization became necessary. If this woman is healthy, if she's willing, and if Jaden responds as positively as it sounds like he did, then from a purely medical perspective, this could solve the feeding crisis that's been threatening his development. The question isn't whether breast milk would benefit him, because the answer to that is unequivocal. The question is whether you're comfortable with the arrangement, given the personal and professional complexities. Marcus stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the hospital parking lot, watching cars navigate through the mid-afternoon traffic while his brain tried to process information that seemed designed to short-circuit normal decision-making processes. Sarah Whitmore had just offered his son something irreplaceable, had given Jaden access to nutrition his body desperately needed through an act that was simultaneously generous and boundary-violating, selfless and strange. The fact that it had emerged from her own grief and loss made it more complicated rather than less, added layers of emotional entanglement that Marcus couldn't begin to untangle while standing in a pediatrician's office trying to figure out if his son was healthy or if this bizarre situation had just created new problems to replace the old ones. "I need to talk to her again," Marcus said finally. "Need to understand if this was a one-time thing driven by hormones and grief, or if there's something more happening here that I should be aware of." Dr. Morrison nodded, making notes in Jaden's chart that would document this appointment in ways that would probably baffle any future doctors who reviewed the records. "Whatever you decide, make sure Jaden continues getting adequate nutrition. His development depends on it. The feeding difficulties we've been tracking aren't sustainable long-term. Something needs to change, whether that's finding a formula that works or exploring alternative options." The drive back to Technova took 40 minutes through typical San Francisco congestion, and Marcus used the time to call his mother in Baltimore, putting the phone on speaker while navigating through the financial district toward the glass tower that housed his office and his CEO, and the impossible situation that had detonated his understanding of professional boundaries. Beverly Thompson had raised 3 sons as a single mother in Baltimore's rougher neighborhoods, had worked double shifts as a hospital administrator to keep food on the table, and Marcus in the magnet school that eventually earned him a scholarship to Berkeley. She'd seen him through Keisha's death, had flown out despite her heart condition, and stayed for 6 weeks helping with Jaden while Marcus learned to function through grief. Her voice on the phone carried that particular tone of maternal concern that suggested she already knew something was wrong before Marcus said a word. "Baby, you sound exhausted. What's happening?" Marcus told her everything, the words spilling out in a confused rush that probably didn't make much sense, but captured the essential insanity of the day. He expected shock, maybe disapproval, possibly anger at this woman who had crossed lines without permission. What he got instead was silence, the kind of thoughtful quiet that meant his mother was actually processing instead of reacting, considering the situation from angles Marcus hadn't thought to examine. "You know your grandmother fed half the neighborhood babies back in the day," Beverly said finally, her voice carrying memories of a South Carolina childhood Marcus only knew through stories. Women helped each other raise children, because that's what community meant. If your milk came in and your neighbor's baby was hungry while she was at work, you fed that child. Nobody thought twice about it, because survival mattered more than whose breast the baby was latched to. Marcus hadn't expected that response, hadn't anticipated his mother reaching for cultural memory that predated modern anxieties about appropriate boundaries. "That was a different time, Mama. This is my boss we're talking about, the CEO of the company. There are power dynamics and professional concerns and 100 reasons why this could explode in my face." Beverly's laugh came dry and knowing, carrying decades of navigating white corporate America as a black woman who'd climbed from secretary to hospital administration through sheer persistence. "Baby, I understand power dynamics better than you think. I also understand that your son has been slowly starving for 8 months while you tried every solution modern medicine could offer. This woman just gave Jaden something you couldn't provide, something his body desperately needed, and she did it from her own grief and loss. That's not power dynamics. That's grace, showing up when you least expect it." The words hit harder than Marcus wanted to admit, exposing the fear underneath his concerns about appropriateness, the shame he'd been carrying about failing to solve Jaden's feeding crisis through acceptable channels. He was supposed to be the provider, the protector, the father who could handle everything even when everything felt impossible. Accepting help from his CEO, from a woman he barely knew, from someone whose own pain had somehow intersected with his son's needs, felt like admitting defeat in ways Marcus wasn't ready to process. What if she's not stable? What if this is some grief reaction that passes and leaves Jaden dependent on something that disappears? Beverly's voice softened, taking on that particular quality she used when Marcus was being stubborn about something he needed to hear. "Then you figure it out the same way you've been figuring everything else out. But right now, today, your son is sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. That's not nothing, Marcus. That's everything. Don't let pride or fear or professional concerns stop you from accepting a blessing just because it comes wrapped in uncomfortable packaging." Marcus pulled into the Technova parking garage, finding his assigned spot on the 3rd level, while Jaden continued sleeping in the back seat with that same profound contentment. The conversation with his mother had shifted something in his perspective, opened space for considering this situation from angles that weren't purely about boundaries and appropriateness. But accepting that shift meant having another conversation with Sarah, meant going back up to the 20th floor and asking questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The engineering floor felt different when Marcus returned, though probably nothing had actually changed beyond his perception of the space where he spent 60 hours a week writing code and debugging systems. Nicole asked about the appointment with casual interest, and Marcus deflected with vague statements about weight checks and formula discussions. not ready to explain the real situation to colleagues who knew Sarah Whitmore only as the terrifying executive who occasionally swept through on corporate tours. The afternoon crawled past with Marcus accomplishing nothing productive, his attention fragmenting between the sleeping baby in the portable crib beside his desk and the 20 floors above, where Sarah presumably sat in her corner office making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. Around 5:30, as the office began its evening exodus toward the parking garage and BART stations and buses that would carry people back to apartments and houses scattered across the Bay Area, Marcus made a decision that felt simultaneously inevitable and terrifying. He packed up Jaden's gear with mechanical precision, everything fitting into the oversized backpack that had become his constant companion, and walked to the elevator bank with his heart rate climbing toward levels usually reserved for sprint intervals or emergency room visits. The executive elevator required a key card Marcus didn't have, but the main elevator went to every floor, even if it meant enduring security protocols and checkpoints. The 20th floor reception area was emptier than it had been at 9 that morning, just Catherine at her desk outside Sarah's office, reading something on her computer with the intense focus that suggested end-of-day email processing. She looked up when Marcus approached, her expression shifting through surprise and suspicion before settling on professional neutrality. "Mr. Thompson, Ms. Whitmore isn't taking meetings today." Marcus adjusted his grip on Jaden, who was starting to wake from the afternoon nap that had lasted 4 hours longer than any previous sleep session in recent memory. "I think she'll want to see me. It's about this morning." Something flickered across Catherine's face. Recognition or understanding, or maybe just the awareness that whatever was happening here fell outside her job description. She picked up her phone, spoke quietly into it, listened for a moment, then gestured toward the heavy oak door that led to the corner office Marcus had only seen in company press releases. "She says to come in." Sarah's office occupied the northwest corner of the building, windows on 2 walls offering views of the Bay Bridge and the fog rolling through the Golden Gate in thick banks that would blanket the city by nightfall. The furniture was minimalist and expensive, steel and glass and leather in shades of black and charcoal. No personal photographs or decorative touches beyond a single orchid on the credenza that looked professionally maintained. Sarah sat behind her desk reviewing documents, and she didn't look up immediately when Marcus entered. Didn't acknowledge his presence until he'd crossed half the distance to her desk and stopped, uncertain whether to sit or stand or speak first. When she finally raised her eyes, Marcus saw exhaustion that went bone deep, the kind of weariness that no amount of sleep could fix, because it came from carrying weight that never got lighter. "I thought you might come back," Sarah said, her voice flatter than it had been in the break room, more controlled, more like the CEO voice Marcus recognized from quarterly meetings. "Sit, please." Marcus settled into one of the leather chairs across from her desk, positioning Jaden on his lap so the baby could see around the office, taking in the world from his father's arms with wide eyes that suggested full awareness despite being barely 8 months old. "I talked to the pediatrician and my mother, and I've been thinking about what happened this morning for the last 6 hours. Sarah closed the folder in front of her with precise movements, giving Marcus her full attention in a way that felt almost overwhelming, like standing in a spotlight that revealed every flaw and inadequacy. "And what conclusions did you reach?" Marcus took a breath, organizing thoughts that still felt jumbled and uncertain despite hours of mental processing. "That I don't understand what happened or why it happened. But I can't deny that Jaden responded to you in ways he's never responded to formula. That the pediatrician confirmed breast milk would be incomparably better for his development than anything I can buy in a store." That my mother reminded me wet nursing used to be normal before modern society decided it was weird. He paused, watching Sarah's expression for reactions that remained carefully controlled, giving nothing away. But I also need to know if this was a one-time thing driven by grief and hormones, or if there's something else happening here that I should understand before I make any decisions about my son's welfare. Sarah stood, moving to the window that overlooked the bridge, her posture rigid in a way that suggested she was holding herself together through conscious effort. I've lost 4 babies in 6 years. 4 pregnancies that ended in different kinds of devastation, each one taking something I can't get back. Last week I lost Emma at 18 weeks, after spending 4 months believing this time would be different. This time my body would cooperate. This time I'd finally get to experience motherhood instead of just failing at it repeatedly. She turned to face Marcus, and the control in her expression had started to crack, showing the grief underneath. When I held your son this morning, when my body responded by producing milk, when he latched on and nursed like he'd been waiting his entire life for exactly that, I felt what I've been chasing for 6 years. I felt needed. I felt capable. I felt like maybe all this suffering had some purpose beyond just destroying me slowly. The honesty in her words created a space Marcus hadn't expected, an opening for something that looked almost like understanding, despite the massive gap between their lives and experiences. I can't give you guarantees about hormones or how long my body will produce milk or whether this makes any kind of sense from a rational perspective. What I can tell you is that feeding your son today was the most important thing I've done in my entire life, more meaningful than any deal I've closed or any company I've built. And if you'll allow it, I'd like to continue, not as your boss, not as some corporate arrangement, but as someone who desperately wants to experience at least part of motherhood, even if it's not with my own biological child. Marcus looked down at Jaden, who had started reaching for his face with chubby hands, babbling nonsense syllables that were slowly developing toward actual words. 8 months of watching his son struggle had taught Marcus to recognize when Jaden was thriving versus merely surviving, and the difference today was undeniable. The baby who had screamed through every formula feeding and spent hours crying from hunger his father couldn't satisfy had become calm and content after 35 minutes at Sarah's breast, had slept more peacefully than Marcus had ever witnessed, had woken alert and engaged instead of fussy and irritable. The decision forming in Marcus's mind felt insane and reckless and completely contrary to every professional instinct he'd developed during his career. It also felt right, in some way he couldn't articulate, like the universe was offering a solution that didn't fit any conventional category, but addressed needs that went deeper than organizational charts or corporate hierarchies. If we do this, Marcus said slowly, testing the words as they emerged, it can't be here. It can't be at the office where people will see and speculate and turn it into something it's not. And we need to be honest about what this is and what it isn't. Sarah returned to her desk, sitting down with visible relief, as if Marcus's words had removed weight she'd been carrying since morning. I understand. My penthouse isn't appropriate either. Too much staff, too many security cameras, too many ways this could leak and become a story that destroys both of us. Your apartment? Marcus nodded, already thinking through logistics that felt surreal to be considering. I live in Mission District. 2-bedroom apartment, nothing fancy, but it's private. You could come after work. Stay for however long Jaden needs. We keep this between us until we figure out if it's sustainable. They discussed details with the same efficiency they might bring to a project kickoff meeting, establishing schedules and expectations and boundaries that felt necessary, even if the entire conversation existed in territory neither of them had ever navigated before. Sarah would come by at 6 each evening, stay until Jaden had nursed and fallen asleep, then leave before the situation could drift into territories that complicated an already impossible arrangement. They would maintain complete professionalism at the office, no special treatment, no acknowledgement of what was happening outside work hours. If questions arose, they would handle them honestly but carefully, protecting both Jaden's well-being and their own privacy. By the time Marcus left her office, darkness had settled over San Francisco completely, the city lights creating patterns that stretched toward distant hills. He carried Jaden through the empty 20th floor toward the elevator, past Catherine's now vacant desk, feeling like he'd just negotiated the strangest agreement of his life. Tomorrow, Sarah would show up at his apartment, would cross the threshold between professional and personal in ways that should feel threatening but somehow didn't, would continue giving his son what Marcus couldn't provide, through an arrangement that existed outside every category he understood. The drive home took him through streets he knew by heart, past the taco trucks on Mission and the murals in Clarion Alley, and the corner store where he bought emergency diapers at 2 a.m. when supplies ran low. His apartment building was nothing special, just one of 1,000 generic structures that housed the workers who kept San Francisco functioning while tech millionaires slept in Pacific Heights mansions. Marcus climbed 3 flights of stairs with Jaden and the overstuffed backpack, unlocked the door to the space that had been his sanctuary and prison for the last 8 months, the place where he'd learned to change diapers and heat bottles and function on 3 hours of sleep while grief waited in every corner. That night, preparing Jaden for bed with the same routine he'd followed since bringing the baby home from the hospital, Marcus noticed differences, subtle enough that he might have imagined them if he weren't looking so carefully. Jaden settled into sleep easier, fussed less during the diaper change, seemed generally more content in ways that probably came from having a full belly for the first time in months. Marcus sat in the rocking chair beside the crib long after Jaden dozed off, watching his son sleep while processing a day that had started normally and ended somewhere completely beyond his ability to map. Tomorrow, Sarah Whitmore would knock on this door, would enter his private space, would nurse his child in his living room while they figured out if this arrangement was sustainable or insane, or possibly both. The thought should have terrified him, should have sent him running to HR or legal counsel or anyone who could explain why this was a catastrophically bad idea. Instead, Marcus felt something closer to cautious hope. The first genuine optimism he'd experienced since watching Jaden's weight percentiles drop toward dangerous territory while every formula brand on the market proved equally useless. He thought about Keisha, wondering what she would make of this situation, whether she'd approve or be horrified, or simply understand that sometimes survival requires accepting help from unexpected places. They'd talked about breastfeeding during the pregnancy, Keisha determined to try, despite horror stories from friends about painful latching and inadequate supply and judgmental lactation consultants. She'd never gotten the chance, had died before holding Jaden long enough to attempt feeding him, and Marcus had assumed that particular door had closed permanently the moment the monitors flatlined. Now it had opened again through the last person Marcus would have predicted, through his CEO's grief intersecting with his son's desperate needs in ways that felt almost supernatural in their timing. Sarah Whitmore was suffering losses Marcus could barely comprehend, carrying pain that had accumulated over years of failed attempts to achieve what most women took for granted. She'd built an empire, had created something that would outlast her, but the one thing she actually wanted kept slipping through her fingers no matter how much money or willpower or strategic thinking she applied. And somehow, In this impossible collision of their separate griefs and needs and failures, they'd stumbled into an arrangement that might actually work, that might solve Jaden's feeding crisis while giving Sarah a taste of the motherhood she'd been chasing for 6 years. It was messy and complicated and violated every professional boundary Marcus had been taught to maintain. It was also the first genuine solution he'd found in 8 months of watching his son suffer. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own adjustments, its own moments of awkwardness and uncertainty as they figured out how to navigate this arrangement. But tonight, Jaden slept peacefully in his crib, properly fed for the first time since birth, and Marcus could hear his son's steady breathing from across the room. That simple fact mattered more than organizational charts or power dynamics or concerns about what other people might think if they knew. Marcus stood, stretching muscles tight from a day spent cycling between shock and confusion and tentative hope. He checked on Jaden one more time, confirming the baby's chest rose and fell with reliable rhythm, then moved to his own bedroom where exhaustion waited to claim him. Tomorrow would start the real experiment, the first deliberate step into territory they'd stumbled into by accident. But tonight, for the first time in longer than Marcus could remember, his son was truly at peace. And that was enough. Sarah arrived at Marcus's apartment at 6:15 the following evening, standing in the hallway outside his door with the tentative posture of someone entering completely foreign territory. She'd changed from the severe black suit into dark jeans and a simple cashmere sweater, her hair down for the first time Marcus had ever witnessed, falling past her shoulders in waves that made her look younger and somehow more vulnerable. The transformation from Ice Queen CEO to nervous woman about to cross an intimate threshold was so complete that Marcus almost didn't recognize her when he opened the door. "Come in. Jaden's been fussy for the last hour. I think he knows you're coming." Sarah stepped into the cramped living room, taking in the space with eyes that probably compared it automatically to her penthouse with its panoramic views and designer furniture. Marcus's apartment was clean, but cluttered with the accumulated chaos of single fatherhood, baby gear occupying every available surface, laundry folded on the couch because the bedroom was too small for proper organization. She didn't comment on the modest surroundings, just set her bag down carefully and held out her arms when Jaden started reaching for her with urgent little sounds that weren't quite crying, but suggested he'd get there soon if his needs went unmet. The transition was immediate and striking. Jaden settled against Sarah's chest, rooting with the same desperate focus Marcus had witnessed yesterday, and within seconds, he'd latched on and begun nursing with intensity that suggested his body remembered exactly what had happened in that 20th floor break room. Sarah sank into the rocking chair Marcus had positioned by the window, her entire frame relaxing as Jaden fed, and Marcus busied himself in the kitchen area pretending to clean dishes that were already clean, because watching this felt too intimate despite having agreed to the arrangement. They didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. Sarah focused entirely on Jaden while Marcus moved between kitchen and living room with manufactured tasks that kept his hands busy. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, more like the cautious quiet of two people navigating new territory without a map, figuring out boundaries through trial and error rather than explicit discussion. Eventually, Marcus ran out of things to pretend to organize and settled on the couch with his laptop, pulling up code reviews that needed completion before tomorrow's stand-up meeting. "You can relax," Sarah finally said, her voice low to avoid disturbing Jaden. "I know this is strange, but we might as well accept that strange is our new normal." Marcus closed the laptop, accepting that productive work wasn't happening while his CEO nursed his son 15 feet away. "How long does your doctor think the milk will last?" the hormones from the miscarriage. Sarah shifted slightly, adjusting Jaden's position with practiced ease that suggested muscle memory was building faster than conscious skill. She wasn't sure. Could be 2 weeks, could be 2 months. The body doesn't follow predictable timelines when it comes to pregnancy loss. Some women dry up immediately. Others produce milk for months afterward. The uncertainty inherent in that answer troubled Marcus more than he wanted to admit. Because if Jaden became dependent on Sarah's milk only to have it disappear abruptly, they'd be back in the same crisis that had nearly required hospitalization. But voicing that concern felt ungrateful, given what Sarah was offering, so Marcus filed it away, along with all the other anxieties accumulating around this arrangement. "What made you pick him up yesterday? Out of all the times Jaden's been at the office, you'd never shown interest before." Sarah's expression shifted, memories crossing her face that carried visible pain. "I heard him crying from my office. The sound cut through a conference call about Q3 projections, and suddenly nothing else mattered except getting to that baby. I told the board I'd call them back and went down to the 15th floor without really thinking about why. When I picked him up, something clicked in my body that I wasn't prepared for." The oxytocin response was so overwhelming, I actually felt lightheaded. She paused, watching Jaden nurse with an expression that mixed wonder and grief in equal measure. "I've held babies before, at company events when executives bring their families. It never affected me like this, never triggered anything beyond polite interest. But Jaden was different. Or maybe my body was different because of Emma, or maybe the universe just decided that particular moment was when everything would align in the worst and best possible way simultaneously." Marcus absorbed this, adding it to his growing understanding of how grief operated, how it could ambush people in conference calls and turn ordinary moments into turning points that rewrote entire life trajectories. His own experience with loss had taught him that trauma didn't follow logical patterns, didn't restrict itself to appropriate times and places, could erupt during code reviews or grocery shopping, or any random Tuesday when the weight became too much to carry alone. The evening established a pattern that would repeat with minor variations over the following weeks. Sarah would arrive around 6, nurse Jaden for 30 to 45 minutes while Marcus worked on his laptop or cooked dinner, then stay another hour while the baby dozed, and they talked about topics that started professional and gradually drifted personal. She told him about growing up in Detroit, about her father who'd worked at the Ford plant until the layoffs came and took his sobriety with them, about learning to code in the public library because home wasn't safe when her father was drinking. Marcus shared his own history, the Baltimore neighborhoods where his mother had raised 3 boys on an administrator's salary, the basketball scholarship that got him into Berkeley when his grades alone wouldn't have been enough, meeting Keisha at Highland Hospital when he'd broken his wrist going for a rebound, and she'd been the nurse who'd wrapped his arm while teasing him about thinking he was LeBron James. By the end of the first week, the awkwardness had faded enough that they could exist in the same space without constant awareness of how bizarre the situation would look to outside observers. Jaden thrived in ways that became undeniable when Marcus took him for the follow-up appointment with Dr. Morrison, and the scale showed 3 pounds gained in 7 days, a growth rate that moved him from the 5th percentile towards something approaching normal. Dr. Morrison documented the improvement with professional detachment, asking questions about feeding frequency and duration that Marcus answered honestly, while deliberately avoiding details about who was providing the milk. The second week brought the first real complication, though it arrived wrapped in such mundane packaging that Marcus almost didn't recognize it as a threat. Nicole from the UX team mentioned during a code review that she'd noticed Sarah leaving the building around the same time as Marcus several evenings in a row, wondered aloud if they'd been assigned to some special project that required after-hours collaboration. Marcus deflected with vague statements about consulting on a personal matter, but the question planted seeds of concern about how long they could maintain this arrangement before someone noticed patterns and started asking questions that had no good answers. That evening, Marcus mentioned the conversation to Sarah while she settled into the rocking chair, with Jaden already rooting urgently against her shoulder. "We need to be more careful about timing. People are starting to notice we leave at the same time." Sarah adjusted her sweater, helping Jaden latch on while considering the problem with the same strategic thinking she probably applied to competitive analysis and market positioning. "I can vary my departure time, make it less predictable. Maybe come here straight from external meetings some days, so I'm not leaving from the office at all." They worked through logistics like they were planning a product launch instead of hiding an arrangement that would probably get them both fired if HR discovered the truth. The conversation revealed how much mental energy they were both investing in maintaining secrecy, in protecting something that felt simultaneously precious and impossible to defend if anyone demanded explanations. Marcus found himself wondering how long they could sustain this level of careful coordination before exhaustion or carelessness created cracks where truth could leak through. The third week marked a shift in their relationship that Marcus noticed but couldn't quite name. Sarah started arriving earlier, staying later, finding reasons to extend the evenings beyond the strictly necessary time required for Jaden to nurse. She'd help with dinner preparation, chopping vegetables while Marcus handled the stove, their movements in the cramped kitchen developing a rhythm that came from repeated practice. They'd eat together after Jaden fell asleep, talking about everything from Technova's upcoming product launch to Sarah's failed IVF attempts, to Marcus's memories of Keisha that were starting to hurt less sharply even as they remained permanently tender. One Thursday evening, while Sarah washed dishes and Marcus dried, she told him about her ex-husband with a flatness that suggested she'd processed this grief long enough that it had lost its immediate sting. "He left after the second miscarriage. Said he couldn't watch me destroy myself chasing something that clearly wasn't meant to happen. I think he expected me to choose him over the possibility of motherhood, to accept childlessness and move on with our lives together. When I couldn't do that, when I kept pursuing fertility treatments despite the emotional and physical toll, he decided I'd made my choice." Marcus set down the plate he'd been drying, giving her his full attention because this felt important in ways that went beyond casual conversation. "Did you ever regret it? Choosing the treatments over the marriage?" Sarah turned off the water, drying her hands on the towel with deliberate movements that bought her time to formulate an answer. "Every day for the first year." Then gradually the regret transformed into something else. Not quite acceptance, but maybe understanding that some people aren't built to carry other people's grief alongside their own. He needed a partner who could compartmentalize loss, who could try for a baby and then move on when it didn't work, instead of letting each failure compound into something that consumed everything. She looked at Marcus with an expression that held both vulnerability and strength, acknowledging pain without being destroyed by it. "I couldn't be that person. Can't be that person. When I want something, I pursue it with everything I have, which is probably why I built a billion-dollar company, but also why I've lost 4 pregnancies without learning when to stop trying." The honesty in her words created intimacy that had nothing to do with the physical act of nursing Jaden, a different kind of closeness built from shared understanding of what it meant to want something desperately while watching it slip away repeatedly. Marcus recognized the pattern from his own experience with grief, the way loss didn't diminish just because time passed, how absence could become a permanent presence that shaped every decision and perspective. "Keisha used to say I loved too hard," Marcus offered, the memory arriving with unexpected gentleness. "That I needed to learn how to want things casually, to care less intensely so disappointment wouldn't hit as brutally. She was probably right, but I don't know how to be any other way." Sarah smiled, a real smile that transformed her face completely, erasing the Ice Queen mask to reveal someone younger and more approachable underneath. Maybe that's why we ended up here. Two people who can't do anything halfway, who commit completely, even when the smart move would be protecting ourselves. The moment stretched between them, charged with recognition that felt dangerous in its implications. Marcus broke eye contact first, returning to the dishes with renewed focus, because acknowledging the connection forming between them meant confronting questions about where this arrangement was heading beyond the immediate practical concerns about Jaden's nutrition. By the fourth week, Sarah had become such a regular presence in Marcus's apartment that Jaden would start fussing around 6 o'clock, regardless of whether he was actually hungry. His internal clock apparently calibrated to expect her arrival. The baby's development had accelerated dramatically, reaching milestones that Dr. Morrison documented with professional satisfaction while carefully avoiding questions about the specifics of Jaden's feeding routine. Marcus watched his son transform from the listless infant who'd barely responded to stimulation into an engaged, alert baby who smiled readily and babbled constantly, reaching for toys with improving coordination and sleeping through most nights in stretches that allowed Marcus to function like a semi-normal human being. But success brought its own complications, particularly around the question of sustainability. Sarah's milk production showed no signs of decreasing, her body apparently committed to the fiction that she was nursing her own biological child rather than someone else's son. Medical literature suggested that continued stimulation could maintain lactation indefinitely, that women throughout history had served as wet nurses for years if demand remained consistent. The implication was clear. This arrangement could continue as long as they wanted it to, which raised questions neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Late one Friday evening, after Jaden had dozed off and Sarah was gathering her things to leave, Marcus finally asked the question that had been building for weeks. What happens when this stops being just about feeding Jaden? When it becomes something more complicated than a practical arrangement? Sarah froze with her bag half packed, her back to Marcus, and the silence that filled the apartment felt heavy with implications neither of them had been willing to name aloud until now. I don't know, she admitted, turning to face him with an expression that mixed fear and hope in ways that probably mirrored his own tangled feelings. I know we said this was just about Jaden's nutrition, just a temporary solution to a medical crisis. But somewhere along the way, it became the most important part of my day, the thing I look forward to more than anything happening at work or anywhere else in my life. Marcus stood, closing the distance between them until only a few feet separated their positions in the small living room where they'd spent 4 weeks building something that didn't fit any category either of them understood. You're my boss. You're 14 years older than me. Everyone would say I'm taking advantage, or you're abusing your power, or this whole situation is completely inappropriate. Sarah held his gaze, not flinching from the uncomfortable truth in his words. I know all of that. Know what it would look like if anyone found out, how it would destroy both our careers and probably get me removed as CEO. But I also know that I've never felt more like myself than I do here, in this cramped apartment with you and Jaden, doing something that has nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market share or any of the metrics that supposedly define success. The vulnerability in her admission broke something loose in Marcus's chest, some final resistance to acknowledging what had been growing between them alongside the practical arrangement about feeding his son. I think I'm falling in love with you, he said, the words emerging quiet but clear, carrying weight that seemed to fill the entire apartment. I know that's insane. I know it complicates everything. But I can't keep pretending this is just about Jaden when you're the first person I've wanted to see every day since Keisha died. Sarah closed the remaining distance, her hand finding his with a tentative touch that asked permission while offering connection. I've been in love with you for 2 weeks. Tried to deny it, tried to convince myself this was just about filling the void Emma left. But that's not what this is. You make me feel seen in ways nobody has since before I became successful enough that people only saw the company or the money or the reputation. Marcus pulled her into an embrace that felt simultaneously natural and earth-shattering, Sarah's frame fitting against his in ways that suggested they'd been moving toward this moment since she'd walked into his apartment 4 weeks ago. They stood holding each other while Jaden slept peacefully in the bedroom, while the San Francisco night settled over the city outside, while everything they'd been carefully not discussing finally found expression in physical contact that promised complications neither of them could fully anticipate. "We can't do this at work," Marcus said into her hair, breathing in whatever expensive shampoo she used that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget. "Can't give anyone ammunition to claim this is about power dynamics or favoritism." Sarah pulled back enough to meet his eyes, her expression serious despite the tears gathering at the corners. Complete professionalism at the office. No special treatment, no acknowledgement of anything happening outside working hours. If anything, I should probably be harder on you than other engineers to avoid any appearance of preferential treatment. They both recognized the inherent absurdity of negotiating professional boundaries while standing in an embrace that had already demolished most conventional definitions of appropriate executive-employee relationships. But the attempt itself mattered, the effort to establish rules that might protect them if this situation eventually exploded in their faces. Marcus kissed her then, tentative at first, and then with growing confidence as Sarah responded with equal intensity. 4 weeks of accumulated tension finding release in physical connection that felt overdue and terrifying in its implications. They kissed like people who'd been denying themselves something essential, who'd finally stopped fighting against what they both wanted, despite all the rational arguments against pursuing it. When they finally separated, breathing hard, Marcus recognized that they'd just crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, that this arrangement had officially become something far more complicated than a practical solution to Jaden's feeding crisis. Sarah must have reached the same conclusion, because she stepped back, creating physical distance while her expressions cycled through emotions too complex to name. "I should go. Need to think about what this means, how we navigate it without destroying everything we built." Marcus nodded, understanding the need for space even as part of him wanted her to stay, to keep talking through implications and complications until they'd mapped every possible consequence. But some things needed processing alone, in the quiet hours when brutal honesty became possible without the distraction of another person's presence. Sarah gathered her things with movements that had lost their earlier efficiency, her hands slightly unsteady as she packed her bag and checked her phone and prepared to return to whatever penthouse apartment awaited her across the city. At the door, she paused, looking back at Marcus with an expression that mixed joy and terror in equal measure. "Same time tomorrow?" Marcus managed a smile that felt shaky but genuine. "Jaden will be waiting. So will I." After she left, Marcus stood in the center of his living room processing what had just happened, what they'd just acknowledged, what doors they'd opened that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could fully predict. He checked on Jaden, confirming the baby slept peacefully, then moved to the window where he could see Sarah's Tesla pull out of the parking lot below, red taillights disappearing into San Francisco traffic. The smart move would be pumping the brakes, establishing firm boundaries, maybe even ending the arrangement before emotional entanglement made everything impossible to untangle. But Marcus had never been good at smart when it contradicted what his heart demanded, had never learned how to want things casually or protect himself from potential devastation. He was all in or all out, committed completely or not at all. And somewhere in the last 4 weeks, he'd committed to Sarah Whitmore in ways that went far beyond agreeing to let her nurse his son. Saturday brought new complications when Beverly called from Baltimore, her voice carrying the particular quality that meant she'd been worrying about something and finally decided intervention was necessary.
Baby, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, even if the answer is complicated.
Marcus settled onto the couch with Jaden playing on a blanket at his feet, toys scattered in the chaos that marked weekend mornings. "What's going on, Mama?" Beverly took an audible breath, gathering courage for whatever question she'd been building toward. "Are you developing feelings for this woman? This Sarah who's been helping with Jaden?" The directness of the question caught Marcus off guard, despite knowing his mother had always possessed uncomfortable accuracy when it came to reading her son's emotional states from 3,000 miles away. "What makes you ask that?" Her laugh came dry and knowing. "Marcus Antonio Thompson, I've been your mother for 28 years. I know when you're falling for someone based on how your voice changes when you talk about them."
Every time you mention Sarah, you sound like you did when you first met Keisha, like the whole world just got brighter and more complicated simultaneously. Marcus closed his eyes, accepting that lying to his mother had never worked, and wouldn't start working now, despite the distance between Baltimore and San Francisco. "I kissed her last night, told her I was falling in love with her. She said she felt the same way." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Marcus started worrying the connection had dropped. But then Beverly spoke with the careful tone she used when delivering hard truths wrapped in love. "Baby, I understand loneliness. Understand wanting connection with someone who sees you beyond the grief and the single parenthood and all the weight you've been carrying. But this woman is your boss, has power over your career, and there's no version of this that doesn't get complicated in ways that could hurt you badly." Marcus watched Jaden grab a plastic ring and try to fit it in his mouth, drooling contentedly, completely unaware that the adults around him were navigating emotional minefields. "I know all the reasons this is a bad idea, Mama. Know it could explode my career, know the age gap means we're in different life stages, know that starting a relationship under these circumstances is probably the worst decision I could make right now." He paused, finding words for feelings that still felt too new to articulate completely. "But she makes me feel alive again, in ways I haven't felt since Keisha died. Makes me remember that I'm more than just Jaden's father, more than a grief-stricken widower trying to survive. When I'm with her, I can breathe fully, instead of just taking shallow breaths to get through the day." Beverly's sigh carried 3,000 miles of maternal concern and understanding fighting for dominance. "Then I won't tell you not to pursue it, because you're a grown man who gets to make his own choices even when those choices scare his mother. But I will tell you to be careful, to protect yourself, and to remember that Jaden needs you stable more than he needs you in love." They talked for another 20 minutes about logistics and timelines and what Marcus would do if the situation fell apart, Beverly extracting promises about maintaining boundaries at work and having exit strategies if things deteriorated. By the time they hung up, Marcus felt both supported and more anxious about the path he'd chosen, his mother's concerns adding weight to worries he'd been trying to suppress through sheer force of optimism. The relationship shifted into something Marcus could only describe as cautiously optimistic over the following 3 weeks. Sarah continuing her evening visits while they navigated the delicate balance between professional distance at work and growing intimacy at home. At Technova, they maintained perfect formality, Sarah walking past Marcus's desk without acknowledgement during her occasional sweeps through the engineering floor. Marcus attending all-hands meetings where she delivered quarterly projections with the same ice-cold precision that had earned her reputation. Nobody seemed to notice anything unusual, which suggested their performance was convincing, or their colleagues were too absorbed in their own concerns to register subtle changes in executive-employee dynamics. But the facade required constant vigilance, mental energy spent monitoring every interaction for signs that might trigger curiosity or suspicion. Marcus found himself avoiding casual conversations about his personal life, deflecting questions about weekend plans or evening activities with vague responses that probably made him seem antisocial, but protected the secret consuming increasingly large portions of his attention. The stress of maintaining dual realities began showing in small ways, insomnia creeping back despite Jaden's improved sleep patterns, a tightness in his shoulders that persisted even after the baby went down for the night. 3 months into the arrangement, Dr. Morrison's office called requesting an urgent appointment to discuss Jaden's development, the receptionist's tone suggesting this wasn't a routine check-in. Marcus drove to the clinic with anxiety building in his chest, watching Jaden babble contentedly in the rearview mirror while imagining worst-case scenarios about mysterious health conditions that weight gain had temporarily masked. The waiting room felt oppressive despite its cheerful pediatric decor, cartoon animals painted on walls that probably looked welcoming to most parents, but struck Marcus as mockingly innocent given the gravity radiating from the receptionist's earlier call. Dr. Morrison greeted them with his usual professional warmth, but his expression carried something new, a mixture of satisfaction and concern that Marcus couldn't quite decode. The examination proceeded normally, Jaden tolerating the stethoscope and ear checks with minimal fussing, until the doctor pulled up growth charts on his computer and rotated the monitor so Marcus could see the trajectory that had transformed over 3 months from dangerously low to impressively robust. Marcus, I need to ask you some direct questions about Jaden's nutrition, and I need completely honest answers regardless of how unconventional the situation might be. The phrasing sent ice through Marcus's veins, the careful neutrality suggesting Dr. Morrison had drawn conclusions that demanded confirmation rather than speculation. What are you asking? The doctor leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses to clean them with that meticulous precision that bought time for difficult conversations. Jaden's weight gain over the past 12 weeks has been extraordinary. We're talking about moving from the 5th percentile to the 50th, a trajectory that's nearly impossible to achieve with formula alone, regardless of brand or feeding schedule. His muscle tone, skin quality, cognitive development, all showing improvements consistent with exclusive breastfeeding from a healthy lactating mother. Marcus felt his throat constrict, knowing where this conversation was heading, but uncertain how to navigate it without exposing details that could destroy everything. The woman I mentioned before, the one who experienced recent pregnancy loss, she's been continuing to nurse Jaden. Her milk production hasn't decreased like we expected. Dr. Morrison replaced his glasses, his gaze direct but non-judgmental. Is this arrangement sustainable long-term? Because if Jaden becomes fully dependent on breast milk and the supply suddenly stops, the transition back to formula could be traumatic given his previous rejection patterns. The question Marcus had been avoiding for weeks suddenly demanded immediate attention, forcing him to confront uncertainties about Sarah's body and their relationship, and how long this impossible situation could continue before biology or circumstances intervened. I don't know. We're taking it week by week, hoping her body continues cooperating. The doctor made notes in Jaden's chart, his expression revealing nothing about whether he approved or disapproved of this unconventional feeding arrangement. From a purely medical standpoint, what's happening is working beautifully for Jaden's development. From a practical standpoint, you need contingency plans in case the situation changes suddenly. Introducing small amounts of solid food might help ease any eventual transition, give him alternative nutrition sources beyond exclusive breastfeeding. They discussed timelines for introducing purees and cereals, strategies for gradual weaning that might protect Jaden if Sarah's milk dried up unexpectedly. But underneath the practical planning, Marcus heard the unspoken concern about building dependency on something inherently unstable, about structuring a baby's nutrition around variables nobody could control or predict with confidence. That evening, Marcus raised Dr. Morrison's concerns with Sarah while she settled into the rocking chair with Jaden already latched and nursing with his usual focused intensity. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting through emotions that ranged from defensive to worried as Marcus outlined the sustainability questions and contingency planning recommendations. "My body shows no signs of stopping," Sarah finally responded, her voice tight with something that sounded like fear beneath the surface confidence. "I pump during lunch at work to maintain supply, do everything lactation consultants recommend to keep production consistent. Unless something catastrophic happens, I should be able to continue indefinitely." Marcus heard the qualifier embedded in that assurance, the acknowledgement that catastrophic events did happen, that Sarah's history included 4 pregnancies ending in catastrophe when everything suggested they shouldn't. Building Jaden's entire nutritional framework around her body meant accepting risk that formula, for all its inadequacies, didn't carry. "We should start introducing solids like Dr. Morrison suggested, not to replace you, but to give Jaden alternatives in case your supply changes." Sarah's expression flickered with something that looked like hurt before settling back into careful neutrality. "Of course. Whatever's best for Jaden." The tension that entered the room suggested they'd touched something deeper than feeding logistics, some fear Sarah carried about becoming dispensable once her primary function could be replaced by jars of puree and rice cereal. Marcus recognized the insecurity because he'd felt it himself during those early months when Jaden's rejection of formula made Marcus feel fundamentally inadequate as a father, incapable of providing the most basic sustenance his child required. "This isn't about replacing you," Marcus clarified, moving to kneel beside the rocking chair so they could maintain eye contact while Jaden nursed. "It's about protecting him if something happens that neither of us can control. You're not just a milk source, Sarah. You're his godmother, the person who saved his life when nobody else could. And nothing about introducing solid food changes that." Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously, nodding acceptance even as her body language revealed ongoing struggle with the implications. "I know. I just keep waiting for the moment this all falls apart. For my body to fail the way it's failed at everything else related to motherhood. The fact that nursing Jaden works feels like borrowed time. Like I'm getting something I don't deserve, and eventually the universe will notice the accounting error and take it back." The vulnerability in her admission broke Marcus's heart, exposing how deeply Sarah's repeated losses had eroded her ability to trust good things when they appeared. He covered her free hand with his own, squeezing gently while searching for words that might penetrate the fear. "You deserve this. Deserve to experience motherhood even if it's not in the conventional way you imagined. Jaden is thriving because of you. And that's not an accounting error or borrowed time. That's you giving something precious to a baby who desperately needed it." They sat together while Jaden finished nursing and dozed off, the apartment quiet except for the distant sounds of city traffic filtering through walls that felt increasingly inadequate to contain the life Marcus was building here. When Sarah finally transferred the sleeping baby to his crib and returned to the living room, she moved directly into Marcus's arms, seeking comfort in physical contact that had become as essential as the feeding arrangement that brought them together. "I'm terrified of losing this," Sarah whispered against his chest. "Losing you and Jaden, and this feeling of being needed for something beyond quarterly earnings and shareholder value." Marcus held her tighter,
understanding the fear because he carried his own version, anxiety about what would happen when their secret inevitably leaked, or when Sarah's body stopped cooperating, or when the inherent instability of their arrangement finally collapsed under its own weight. Then we make the most of what we have right now, today. Stop borrowing tomorrow's problems and focus on the fact that tonight, Jaden is healthy and we're together, and that's enough. The philosophy sounded better than it probably was, borrowed optimism masking genuine concern about sustainability. But sometimes borrowed optimism was all anyone had when the alternative was drowning in catastrophic what-ifs that might never materialize. The crisis Marcus had been dreading arrived on a Tuesday morning 4 months into their arrangement, delivered via an email from TechCrunch that pinged his phone at 7:30 while he was preparing Jaden's morning bottle of supplemental formula. The subject line read, "Ice Queen Secret, Technova CEO spotted in unexpected location." And Marcus's stomach dropped before he even opened the message to see the photographs someone had taken of Sarah entering his apartment building 3 evenings in a row, time-stamped images that proved pattern rather than coincidence. The article didn't know about Jaden, didn't understand the actual nature of Sarah's visits, but it didn't need accurate information to cause catastrophic damage. The speculation alone was enough. Paragraphs wondering about inappropriate relationships between executives and subordinates. Questions about whether this represented abuse of power or favoritism that violated Technova's ethics policies. Marcus's name wasn't mentioned, the journalist apparently unable to identify which specific apartment Sarah had been visiting, but that protection felt temporary, a brief reprieve before someone connected the dots and his identity became public knowledge. Sarah's text arrived 30 seconds later, 3 words that conveyed volumes. "We need to talk." Marcus called his mother, explained the situation in rapid sentences while simultaneously getting Jaden dressed and fed, Beverly's voice on speaker providing the grounding presence he desperately needed while his world tilted sideways. "Baby, you knew this was a possibility when you started this arrangement. The question now is how you handle it, whether you tell the truth or let speculation fill the vacuum." Marcus hadn't considered telling the truth as a viable option, had assumed their only play was denial and misdirection. But his mother's suggestion made him pause mid-diaper change. "If we tell the truth, Sarah loses her job. The board won't tolerate a CEO in this kind of situation, regardless of the actual facts." Beverly's response came firm and certain. "Maybe. Or maybe honesty buys you more grace than lies. Maybe people understand grief and loss and desperate measures better than you think. Either way, you can't control the outcome, only whether you face it with integrity or deception." The advice settled in Marcus's chest with uncomfortable weight, demanding he consider options that felt terrifying in their potential consequences. He finished dressing Jaden, grabbed the overstuffed backpack that contained everything a baby might need during a workday, and headed to Technova with his phone already lighting up with messages from colleagues asking if he'd seen the article, if he knew anything about what was happening with Sarah. The office felt electric with gossip when Marcus arrived. Engineers clustered around computer screens reading the TechCrunch piece and offering theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. Nobody connected him to the story yet, his anonymity providing temporary shelter from the speculation storm, but Marcus knew that protection wouldn't last. Someone would remember seeing Sarah near his desk, or notice she left around the same time he did, or piece together fragments that individually meant nothing, but collectively told an accurate story. Sarah's emergency all-hands meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. The entire company summoned to the main auditorium for an announcement that the calendar invite described only as critical company update. Marcus attended because absence would draw more attention than presence, settling into a back row with Jaden strapped to his chest in the carrier, trying to project calm he absolutely didn't feel.
while the auditorium filled with employees speculating loudly about whether they were getting acquired or going public or experiencing some other corporate upheaval. Sarah walked onto the stage at 10 precisely, her posture rigid with the control Marcus recognized from moments when she was barely holding herself together through sheer force of will. She wore her trademark severe black suit, hair pulled into that painfully tight bun, every inch the Ice Queen CEO who'd built a billion-dollar company through strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. But Marcus could see the cracks in her armor, the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the podium, the tightness around her eyes that suggested she'd been crying recently. Many of you have seen the TechCrunch article that published this morning, Sarah began, her voice projected through speakers that carried it to every corner of the packed auditorium. The article speculates about inappropriate relationships and ethics violations based on photographs of me visiting an employee's residence over several months. I'm here to address those speculations directly, rather than allowing rumor and misinformation to fill the vacuum. The room went completely silent. 1,500 employees collectively holding their breath while Sarah prepared to detonate whatever bomb she'd assembled. 4 months ago, I experienced my 4th pregnancy loss. My daughter Emma died at 18 weeks gestation, the latest in a series of miscarriages that have defined my attempts at motherhood for the past 6 years. In the immediate aftermath, my body continued producing milk due to sustained pregnancy hormones, a biological response that occurs in some women following late-term loss. Sarah paused, her hands gripping the podium so tightly her knuckles went white, and Marcus felt his own breathing stop as he realized what she was about to reveal. At the same time, one of our engineers was struggling with his 8-month-old son who had severe feeding difficulties, rejecting all formula brands and dropping to dangerously low weight percentiles that threatened to require hospitalization. When I held this baby, my body responded by letting down milk, and the infant nursed for the first time since his mother's death during childbirth 8 months prior. The collective gasp that rippled through the auditorium felt like a physical force, shock radiating outward as employees processed information that violated every assumption about their CEO's private life. Marcus held Jaden closer, the baby mercifully sleeping through a moment that was about to expose them both to scrutiny neither had chosen. I have spent the last 4 months serving as wet nurse to this employee's child, visiting his home each evening to breastfeed an infant who was literally starving because his body couldn't tolerate artificial nutrition. This arrangement has been conducted with full medical supervision, with the knowledge and approval of the baby's pediatrician, and with absolute professional boundaries maintained at all times within this workplace. Sarah's voice cracked slightly on the final sentence, emotion breaking through the clinical delivery, and Marcus watched her visibly gather herself before continuing. There is no romantic relationship, no abuse of power, no favoritism in hiring or promotion or compensation. There is only a woman who lost her 4th child, trying to experience at least part of motherhood by helping an infant who desperately needed what her body could provide. The silence in the auditorium had transformed from shocked to something else, a collective processing that Marcus couldn't quite read from his position in the back row. He scanned faces around him, seeing expressions that ranged from sympathy to disgust to confusion. Employees struggling to reconcile the Ice Queen CEO with this vulnerable woman confessing intimate loss and unconventional choices. I am resigning as CEO effective immediately, Sarah continued, the words landing like physical blows. Not because I believe I did anything wrong, but because I understand that this situation compromises my ability to lead effectively, regardless of the actual facts. The board has already accepted my resignation, and interim leadership will be announced within the hour. Marcus felt the world tilt. everything he'd feared condensing into reality as Sarah systematically destroyed her career to protect the truth about what they'd been doing. He wanted to stand up, to shout that she didn't need to do this, that they could find another way to manage the fallout. But moving would identify him as the employee in question, would expose Jaden to the judgment and speculation Sarah was trying to shield them from by taking full responsibility. I want to be absolutely clear about one thing. Sarah's voice strengthened, finding power in honesty that corporate messaging had never provided. I've built this company from nothing into something that employs 1,500 people and creates value for millions of customers. I'm proud of that work, proud of what we've accomplished together. But the last 4 months, nursing this baby, experiencing a shadow of what motherhood might have been, has meant more to me than any acquisition or product launch or valuation milestone. She paused, tears now visible on her face despite the bright stage lighting, vulnerability on full display for every employee watching. We build companies. We chase valuations and market share and competitive advantage. But sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply help another human being survive. That's what I chose to do. And I would make the same choice again, regardless of the professional cost. The auditorium erupted into chaos the moment Sarah stepped off stage, employees shouting questions that went unanswered as she disappeared through the side exit. Marcus sat frozen in his seat, while people around him debated and speculated and argued about what they'd just witnessed. Jaden waking up and starting to fuss against his chest. He needed to leave before someone connected the dots, needed to get out of this building before his identity became public, and the speculation turned toward him. But Catherine, Sarah's assistant, appeared at his row before he could move, leaning down to whisper urgently.
Miss Whitmore asks that you bring Jaden to her office. She's waiting.
Marcus followed Catherine through hallways that felt surreal, passing colleagues who were too absorbed in processing Sarah's announcement to notice him slipping toward the executive elevator. The 20th floor was eerily quiet, most of the C-suite executives presumably in emergency sessions with legal and PR trying to manage the fallout. Catherine ushered him into Sarah's office and closed the door, leaving Marcus alone with the woman who'd just sacrificed everything to protect their secret. Sarah stood by the window overlooking the bay, her back to him, shoulders shaking with sobs she'd suppressed during the public announcement. Marcus crossed to her, Jaden between them as he wrapped his arms around her from behind, feeling her body shake with the force of released emotion. You didn't have to resign, Marcus managed, his own voice breaking. We could have found another way. Sarah turned in his arms, her face destroyed by tears and grief, and something that might have been relief underneath the devastation.
Yes, I did.
The board gave me an ultimatum. End the arrangement and submit to ethics investigation, or resign immediately. I couldn't end this. Couldn't abandon Jaden when he's still dependent on me. Couldn't walk away from the only thing that's made me feel human in years. She reached for Jaden, taking him from Marcus's arms and holding him close, while fresh tears streamed down her face.
I built an empire, Marcus. Created something that will outlast me and employ thousands of people and generate billions in value. But I couldn't create life. Couldn't carry a pregnancy to term. Couldn't be a mother in the way I desperately wanted.
Her voice dropped to a whisper, raw with pain that went back years.
This baby, your son, gave me the only taste of motherhood I'll probably ever experience. How could I choose corporate leadership over that? How could I prioritize a job title over the chance to be needed by someone who doesn't care about my net worth or market position?
Marcus understood then,
that this hadn't been a choice for Sarah. Not really. That her decision to resign had been inevitable the moment the board forced her to pick between professional reputation and personal meaning.
She'd spent 6 years chasing motherhood through fertility treatments and repeated loss, had built walls of professional achievement around the emptiness where children should have been, and Jaden had finally given her access to the things she actually wanted beneath all the corporate success.
"What happens now?"
Marcus asked, the question encompassing so many uncertainties he couldn't articulate individually. Sarah wiped her eyes, attempting to compose herself while still holding Jaden close.
Now I figure out who I am without the CEO title. Start the foundation I've been planning for years to help women dealing with infertility and pregnancy loss. Continue being Jaden's godmother and wet nurse for as long as my body cooperates. She met Marcus's gaze directly, vulnerability mixing with determination. And if you'll have me, I'd like to try building something real with you.
Not a secret arrangement we hide from the world, but an actual relationship where we figure out what this is and where it's going. Marcus felt something unlock in his chest. Permission to want this fully instead of carefully, to pursue Sarah without the constant fear of professional consequences now that those consequences had already materialized.
"I love you," he said simply, the declaration feeling simultaneously overdue and perfectly timed. "Have loved you for weeks, but was too scared to say it clearly. You gave up everything for Jaden, for me, and I don't know how to process that level of sacrifice." Sarah kissed him then, proper and deep, Jaden squirming between them, but tolerating the contact with his usual good nature. When they separated, Sarah was smiling despite the tears, something lighter in her expression than Marcus had seen during all their careful evening visits. "I didn't give up everything. I gave up a job that was slowly killing me, that demanded I be someone I'm not, that required suppressing everything that makes me human. What I got in return is worth infinitely more." The following 48 hours passed in a blur of media attention that transformed Sarah from Ice Queen CEO to polarizing figure in debates about motherhood, corporate leadership, and the boundaries of appropriate workplace relationships. The initial TechCrunch article spawned hundreds of follow-ups, op-eds arguing both sides, think pieces about wet nursing and modern parenting and women's bodies. Marcus's identity leaked within 24 hours, his LinkedIn profile suddenly flooded with connection requests from journalists, and his apartment building besieged by photographers, hoping for images of him and Sarah together. Beverly flew out from Baltimore, despite her heart condition, arriving with enough motherly concern and practical support to help Marcus navigate the chaos. She took one look at Sarah when they finally met properly, the former CEO showing up at Marcus's apartment for the evening feeding while camera flashes went off in the parking lot below, and pulled her into a hug that lasted long enough to make Sarah cry again. "Thank you for saving my grandson," Beverly said simply when they separated. "Thank you for loving him enough to give up everything." The public response split sharply along predictable lines, conservative commentators condemning the arrangement as inappropriate regardless of circumstances, progressive voices celebrating Sarah's choice to prioritize personal meaning over corporate achievement. But underneath the political noise, something unexpected emerged. Support from mothers who'd struggled with breastfeeding or infant feeding difficulties. Women sharing stories about wet nursing arrangements that had saved their children. Acknowledgement that sometimes survival required unconventional solutions. 3 weeks after Sarah's resignation, a producer from a major morning show reached out requesting an interview. Marcus and Sarah debated the wisdom of further exposure, ultimately deciding that controlling their narrative mattered more than hiding from ongoing speculation. The interview aired on a Tuesday morning, both of them sitting on a studio couch while Jaden played between them,
answering questions about how they'd met, why Sarah had agreed to nurse someone else's child, what their relationship had become in the aftermath of public exposure. The host, a woman in her 50s who'd built her career on empathetic but probing interviews, asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. Sarah, you were one of the most powerful CEOs in Silicon Valley. You gave that up for a baby who isn't biologically yours, for a relationship that violates conventional boundaries. Do you regret it? Sarah looked at Jaden, then at Marcus, her expression completely open in ways the Ice Queen would never have allowed. I spent 6 years and over $400,000 trying to have a biological child. 4 pregnancies, 4 losses, each one taking a piece of my soul I'll never get back. I built a billion-dollar company thinking that achievement would fill the void, that professional success would compensate for not being a mother. She paused, choosing words carefully. Nursing Jaden taught me that meaning doesn't come from valuations or market share. It comes from being needed by someone who doesn't care about your accomplishments, who just wants you present and available and willing to give them what they require to survive. I don't regret giving up the CEO position. I regret that it took me 42 years and 4 dead children to understand what actually mattered. The interview went viral within hours, clips circulating on social media with commentary that ranged from supportive to vicious. But Marcus noticed something shifting in the overall discourse. Mothers coming forward with stories about cross-nursing and milk sharing, medical professionals defending the practice as safe and beneficial when done with appropriate screening. The shame and scandal that initially dominated coverage began giving way to more nuanced discussion about different paths to motherhood, about how grief could intersect with joy in ways that defied conventional categories. Dr. Morrison called a week after the interview aired, his voice carrying satisfaction Marcus hadn't heard in their previous conversations. I've received over 300 calls from mothers asking about wet nursing arrangements for babies with feeding difficulties. Your story is changing how people think about this, Marcus, making it acceptable again to seek help in ways that were normal for most of human history. The observation landed with unexpected weight, suggesting that their private arrangement had somehow become public advocacy. Their survival strategy transformed into permission for other families facing similar crises. 6 months after Sarah's resignation, she officially launched the Emma's Legacy Foundation with an initial commitment of $200 million, focused on supporting women through infertility, pregnancy loss, and alternative paths to motherhood. The foundation funded milk banks across California, provided grants for IVF treatments, offered counseling for families navigating adoption and surrogacy. Sarah poured into the work the same intensity she'd brought to building Technova, but now directed toward helping others avoid the isolation and repeated devastation she'd experienced. Marcus transitioned to a position at a smaller startup where his skills were valued, but the pressure felt manageable, where leaving at reasonable hours to help with Jaden didn't mark him as insufficiently committed. The pay cut was significant, but survivable, and the reduced stress made him a better father and partner than he could have been while grinding through 80-hour weeks at Technova. Jaden thrived, his development accelerating in ways that suggested the early feeding difficulties hadn't caused lasting damage. He started walking at 11 months, speaking his first words shortly after, growing into a cheerful toddler who split his attachment equally between Marcus and Sarah. The nursing continued until Jaden was 15 months old, when Sarah's supply finally began decreasing and solid foods had largely replaced breast milk in his diet. The transition was gradual and gentle, Sarah's body slowly relinquishing a function it had maintained far longer than medical literature suggested was typical. On a Saturday morning, 18 months after that first shocking discovery in the 20th floor break room, Marcus found himself at San Francisco City Hall with a small group assembled for a wedding nobody had expected when this journey began. Sarah wore a simple cream dress, her hair down and natural, no trace of the Ice Queen remaining in the woman smiling at him while they exchanged vows, witnessed by Beverly, a few close friends, and Jaden in a tiny suit acting as ring-bearer with enthusiastic incompetence. The ceremony was brief and intimate, focusing on the journey that brought them here rather than conventional wedding script. When the officiant pronounced them married, Marcus kissed his wife while their son giggled and clapped, and everything that had seemed impossible 2 years ago crystallized into a reality more meaningful than anything Marcus could have planned or predicted. "I still can't believe this worked," Marcus whispered against Sarah's hair during their first dance at the tiny reception in a restaurant they'd rented for the afternoon. "That we survived the scandal and built something real." Sarah pulled back enough to meet his eyes, her expression radiant in ways that had nothing to do with makeup or strategic image management. "We survived because we stopped pretending, stopped hiding what we needed and who we were, and what mattered beyond professional reputation. Turns out honesty and vulnerability are more powerful than any corporate strategy." Later that evening, after guests had departed and Jaden was sleeping peacefully at Beverly's hotel room, Marcus and Sarah sat on the couch in what was now their shared apartment, larger than his original place but still modest by standards Sarah could easily afford. "Do you miss it?" Marcus asked, the question encompassing Technova and the CEO title and the power that came with leading a billion-dollar company. Sarah considered seriously, not offering easy platitudes but genuine reflection. "I miss the intellectual challenge sometimes, the satisfaction of solving complex problems. But I don't miss the person I had to become to succeed in that world. Don't miss the isolation or the constant performance, or the way achievement never actually filled the emptiness." She shifted to face him more directly, her hand finding his. "Jaden saved my life, Marcus. Not metaphorically or dramatically, but actually saved me from a path that was destroying me slowly. He gave me permission to want something beyond professional success, to acknowledge that building companies wasn't what I actually needed." Marcus understood, having traveled his own version of that journey, learning that being a good father mattered more than impressing managers or climbing corporate ladders. They sat together in comfortable silence, the city lights visible through windows that overlooked a neighborhood where actual families lived instead of tech millionaires, where children played in parks and people knew their neighbors' names. Jaden woke them at 6 the next morning, having been delivered back by Beverly, who had her own flight to Baltimore to catch. The toddler climbed into bed between them, demanding breakfast with the imperious tone of someone who knew he was loved unconditionally by the two people who'd fought so hard to keep him healthy and thriving. Sarah scooped him up, carrying him toward the kitchen while Marcus followed, the three of them moving through morning routines that had become familiar through repetition. This was what they'd chosen when Sarah resigned from Technova, when Marcus accepted a position with lower pay but better balance, when they decided that building a family mattered more than maintaining the careers that had defined them before grief and circumstance created unexpected opportunities. Not everyone understood their choices, not everyone approved of how they'd navigated those impossible early months, but understanding and approval from outsiders had never been the point. Watching Sarah make pancakes while Jaden banged on his high chair tray, demanding immediate breakfast, Marcus felt gratitude for the unlikely path that brought them here, for the grief that intersected in ways neither could have predicted, for a baby's desperate hunger meeting a woman's equally desperate need to nurture. They'd built something real from broken pieces, had created family from circumstances that should have remained professional boundaries, had found love in the last place either expected to discover it. The world might debate whether their arrangement had been appropriate or scandalous or revolutionary, but for the three people eating breakfast together in a San Francisco apartment while morning light streamed through east-facing windows, the only thing that mattered was that they'd survived. They'd found each other, and they'd built something worth more than any corporate valuation or professional title could measure.